Welcome to episode 27 of Conversations for the End. Today's guest is Tiago Faleiro. He's a PhD candidate at GCAS developing a philosophical framework to better understand the psychedelic experience and support long-term integration. Synthesizing philosophy, theology, neuroscience, and 4E cognitive science, the research addresses a critical gap in the psychedelic renaissance. It posits that religious traditions offer essential tools for personal transformation, and that orientating towards a transcendent ideal of the good is vital for human flourishing and long-lasting positive outcomes in psychedelic therapy. He holds a Master's in Science in Applied Neuroscience from King's College London, where his research focused on psychedelic therapy on depression, following undergraduate studies in philosophy and psychology. He is also the author of In Search of the Infinite, a memoir blending autobiography with philosophical inquiry. Tracing a journey through altered states of consciousness, it explores how the psychedelic experience and mysticism more broadly reshapes identity and how these insights can be integrated into a scientific worldview while respecting religious tradition. The intersection of the sacred and the scientific is further explored in his recent release, The Age of Spiritual Blindness: How Technology Threatens Mankind. This book offers a critical examination of the philosophical background of the current technological age and its role in eroding human agency and corrupting the deepest of human values. It argues that theology alone possesses the depth to challenge a world reduced to metrics and computation and is essential for recovering the meaning of the sacred. Tiago brings these complex ideas to the public through the Anagogy podcast, exploring consciousness, religion, and sense-making in dialogue with leading thinkers including John Vervaeke, Graham Harman, Jonathan Paju, John Cottingham, and many others. He also served as the honorary research assistant for drug science, bringing the gap between academic research and public understanding through accessible technical writing about the most recent psychedelic literature. This episode was a lot of fun. Tiago and I went into psychedelics and into the kind of modern day worldview. I recommend that you sit through this, strap in, because it might give you some insights about how you're seeing the world, how you're experiencing the world, and maybe what that's doing to you and whether that's a good or a bad thing. So yeah, let's just get to it, shall we? If you're following on the Spotify's, listening on there and Apple and whatnot, then please subscribe on YouTube for more videos. If you are watching on YouTube, then yeah, subscribe to the page, Instagram, TikTok. That's about it. All right, guys, without any more wait, Tiago Faleiro. Tiago, welcome to the show.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
So let's get into it. I want to kind of set the scene before we get into your idea of us as humanity living in the age of spiritual blindness and the kind of possible things to be aware of when it comes to technology. I want to kind of set the landscape of how you got there. So your work, In Search of the Infinite, a psychedelic memoir, which is available on your site, talks about your experiences with psychedelics. So with someone picking that up for the first time and reading through it, describe what it is. You obviously include quite detailed trip logs, your reflections, and how you interweave kind of philosophy as it goes through, more so in the latter stages perhaps. Just give us an overview of that work and those experiences.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for having me. And yeah, I suppose the book is a good place to start because to some degree the book is also where kind of like my whole intellectual journey began to a large degree. Now, in terms of what to expect, it at its simplest form, it's exactly how you described it, in the sense of like it's just trip logs. Like to some degree, it is that basic. Now, the thing that might be a little bit more interesting is that when it comes to like people discussing these types of experiences, um, usually they try to like have this like post hoc analysis that tries to be a bit more detailed. Um, after the fact, or they do it while they're tripping, and this is a bit more rare, but sometimes happens on kind of like specific forums for trip logs or on Reddit or things like that. But usually those are kind of like very scattered, just like a few sentences, few paragraphs, something like that. And what's maybe a bit special about mine is that mine is kind of like it's during the trip itself, but I do write quite a lot, so they do feel like book chapters, and essentially that's what they are. Each trip is a chapter essentially. Um, and yeah, and so usually how I set up kind of my experiences for that book is that I would watch a movie. I kind of the way that I was thinking about it is that I was kind of like consuming arts to kind of like stimulate what I should think about. And then I just literally had kind of like an open Word on my computer, and then I would just write, and things would come to mind, and I would just write and write, and I would kind of like alternate that between writing and then like going to bed with headphones with eye mask and just like listening to music and whatnot, and I would just do that, and then I would do some editing afterwards so that kind of the sentence structure and whatnot is all a bit more coherent, but the content itself, especially in the beginning, came from the ship itself. Um, and yeah, and kind of like that's basically the entire book. It was written over 7 years or so, and it describes in many ways. Uh, well, the way I like to think about it is it describes my life really. That's why I call it the psychedelic memoir, because I do truly feel like it's a memoir of my life. And it certainly has a lot of the seeds for a lot of the work that I've done on technology, as you now mentioned. But also, the main way that I like to frame the work in my mind is truly the transition from kind of like materialistic thinking to like a religious worldview. That's how I think about it for myself. So um, when people a lot of times they ask me, because like I come from a very like completely scientific background, and so a lot of people that I deal with that are like completely scientific, completely secular, completely materialistic, and they find religion either completely absurd or without any meaning or intelligibility whatsoever. And a lot of times they ask me like, how the hell did you end up with your views? And the book is exactly that answer. It's like if you read the book, you'll know exactly how someone that is fairly educated, in the sense of like compared to the average person. I'm certainly, no, I'm certainly not lacking any argumentation against theism or something. Like I'm pretty familiar with like philosophy of religion and all the typical criticisms. So the way that I like to think about it is like, how exactly does someone like that end up caring about religion? The only thing, though, is that I don't like about this work is because I set it up as this like progression in my life. I think that most people, what they tend to assume is, okay, this guy wrote a book on psychedelics. While on psychedelics, first of all, he's kind of crazy already. But then the fact that he became religious, he just became religious just because he had some epiphany of like some mystical experience in psychedelics. But like this, he was clearly just on drugs, and therefore like his whole approach is completely nonsensical. Like you just have a religious experience on drugs, that means nothing, and that's most definitely not what happened. So like when I mean a religious worldview, I truly mean how one thinks about reality, and not just because now I'm convinced of a certain metaphysical system just because I experienced it during any given trip. But yeah, I suppose that's an overview of the book.
Yeah, and I like what you said there about it's not simply just you having these experiences and then taking them as a given immediately from the sort of phenomenological experience. You're kind of interpreting that. And I've always sort of done the same with, I think, my experiences with substances like that, and with kind of other transpersonal experiences that kind of teeter into the realm of perhaps mystical, where they might happen, and then I guess through a period of integration, or maybe something more kind of consciousness orientated, where it becomes an actual idea of, okay, well, this was the thing, this is the phenomenology, this was the experience. I need to like break this apart to see if it has any heft to it. You know, is it, what was this? And try and make sense of it in a way. Obviously, my background academically is kind of Jungian, and I spent many years, the best part of 6 years, following some quite profound experiences, trying to make sense of them through that lens. And it does give it more weight, and it does give it a bit more of a foundation, as opposed to just the, not that there isn't lots of utility in the kind of awe and the mystery of the experiences themselves. But yeah, I think it's a nice approach to try and say, okay, well, what was that beyond that, in some sense? You know, maybe not that literal, but exploring it in that way. Are there any standout moments that you would mention in those experiences over those years that kind of stand out to you from the kind of phenomenological perspective, and then sort of post reflection on them?
Yeah, I would say basically any time that I had like some very strong experience of what I typically like to call the sacred, which surprisingly wasn't many. So like I kind of forgot how many chapters the book has, but quite a while, like maybe something like 15, 17, maybe. But I only truly kind of like dive into a religious realm, let's say. Not that often, like maybe 4, 5 at best. And obviously, well, not obviously, but most of them a bit more towards the end. And those are certainly what have the most weight for me, especially because if you read the book, you'll realize that I was fighting those experiences to a large degree, because I always considered religion has this, like, I felt an affinity towards religious thinking, but at the same time, because I found it so overwhelming and so complex, I kept like shoving it aside, and so I kept like trying to be within the realm of philosophy. Like I was always trying to translate all that I thought religion was back into philosophy. But then what happened is that in these experiences, they kept calling me to the other side. Like they kept pulling me, even though I was running away from it so much. And I kept trying a bunch of things. I was even trying lower doses. But it's just I was ending up on that place either way. And so first of all, the fact that happened is was very influential for me, and really kind of, yeah, it's something that you wouldn't necessarily expect, especially after I was already, you know, kind of working with these substances and kind of within this framework for quite a while. So like, why didn't I have religious experiences then? And so, but it was kind of like this slow shifting of worldview, and then once in a while, I was just like slapped in the face of like, someone trying to wake me up, metaphorically. And yeah, and there was several of those experiences, and none of them, again, I kind of like take them to be influential, not necessarily because I take them as true in any like literal, like propositional sense, but because they induced a certain shift of perspective that then influenced, something else. But one that came to mind that is pretty later in the book was when I kind of had this vision of kind of like a spiritual father, kind of like guiding me and consoling me in kind of like my spiritual and moral journey. That really shifted my thinking towards being more okay with traditional forms of religiosity, that I could kind of like allow myself to dive into the tradition without always second guessing the tradition. It's like, yeah, the tradition says this, but like, does that really make sense? They're just like a bunch of dudes that said this. Like, who knows if this is true or not? But because of a lot of reasons that kind of I go through in the book, I do end up kind of like trusting and trusting more the tradition, and I found that through that it was quite helpful for me, that I could look deeper into reality is always what I like to say. If I put this particular lens on, and I don't have to second guess the glasses that I'm wearing every single time. Um, Another one was also when I was kind of started thinking about a lot more deeply about technology as well. I believe that was watching. I don't know if it was watching the movie Gravity or Blade Runner. I kind of forgot, but one of these two. And that's also when it hit me of like really kind of the core essence of technology. And because in my thinking, technology and sacredness are always so tied together, um, I inevitably kind of saw the other side as well. And that was pretty influential as well. Um, and another one that had a lot of weight for me was also a bit near the end, where I had this like very powerful vision um, of kind of like love has this kind of unity of identity, that kind of like love being very connected to the very old philosophical problem of the one and the many, of being like the very structure of being, really. And this is all very abstract and it's very difficult to talk about, so I can't really explain this properly without going into a rabbit hole. But it's not like I took the vision as if I was like having this pure raw access to reality as such, but it did force me to think a little bit deeper about metaphysics, which I've always tended to reject. I've always thought, let's stick into phenomenology on kind of like what actually matters existentially for me, without necessarily worrying about the the structure of reality. But that's really made me think that actually the structure of reality does matter when you look deep enough, and it's very complicated. It's very speculative, but yeah, it made me think a little bit more deeply about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mention the kind of father, like a masculine father-like figure in that first instance, and I think what came to my mind was obviously following that. You talked about, you used the glasses analogy as a way of seeing, and if I think symbolically, I orientate towards the masculine principle as a kind of principle of consciousness, right? Of kind of awareness, and then the feminine would be the material if we're speaking symbolically. And it seems interesting, not to unpack it too much or be speculative about it, but you have this kind of masculine figure, this father figure that you begin to trust, and then that kind of does translate from the archetypal realm, the imaginal realm, into the phenomenological realm of your perception, right? Because you're trusting this father figure in the trip that then could be seen as a symbolic image of the trusting of those new glasses, that new perception, that new way of seeing the world. Does that kind of resonate? That's kind of what I was feeling from that, which was quite interesting, how these things can kind of cross over both perceptually and archetypically. In sort of Jungian phenomenology, those that have written on it, we would say that, like, Roger Brooke will say that like the complexes and the archetypes are a way of the way the world is disclosed, right? So it kind of lines up with that. Yeah, and I also understand this idea, again, as someone who's dipped my toe, so to speak, into these waters of the psychedelic experience, that so much of it is ineffable, right? Putting it into words kind of strips away certain aspects of it that you can't really get down in any way beyond the experience itself. And even then it's hard to kind of process that inside. Yeah, and it made me think of, again, Jung. I read something this week where he was talking about how Jung had the kind of psychological side, and he talks about archetypes as patterns of behavior, and then he uses myth to kind of then deepen the psychology. So it kind of goes slightly beyond the nuts and bolts aspects of general psychology to show the archetype as active. But I think it was Christopher Hawke basically says that even that in itself, even myth, even describing these things in the way that Jung did, is limited because the archetypes and those experiences in themselves there are just elements of reality, of experience that are kind of unknown and you can use ideas to better describe them, but you can't fully describe them. So that's what came to me there. One thing I wanted to touch on while I was reading, you mentioned at the start of the memoir, obviously in this journey, kind of from being a bit more of is it fair to say slightly rigid materialist,
Oh yeah,
thinking,
absolutely.
yeah,
That would be the lowest the lowest intensity you can put it at.
So you had that kind of way of seeing the world, and then moving back more towards mystery and the numinous, and I guess religion in a sense, right? It's not necessarily, it's your sense of it, your own. I mean, maybe we can get into that. But you mentioned that your mother passed away while you were writing that work, and again, something that came to my mind. I was wondering, do you feel like any symbolic or existential resonance between the kind of loss of your biological, physical mother and then what you seem to gain through those experiences, which seem to be a new kind of reverence, perceptual way of seeing the symbolic mother in some sense, kind of re-souling matter, if we're speaking in the way Carl Jung might, bringing the kind of lived element of the material world, or at least reconsidering it, into your experience. Do you see a kind of relation between those two events?
Interesting. I would have to think a bit more deeply about it, and I would have to also revisit my Jung, because I was also very Jungian when I was younger, like especially when I started that book. Like that was basically almost my entire framework. Like I was Jungian, and that's it. That's how I saw the world. But now, it's been, I don't know, it's quite a long time, like 5 years maybe since I last read Jung. So it's not as fresh in my mind. And I know that the way he describes is like can be quite nuanced. So I also don't want to reject it outright. However, with what I remember right now and based on what you said, I would say that kind of like applying that archetype would that doesn't necessarily feel um, that it does justice to my experience, I would say. And that's also a little bit where I felt like a bit limited with Jung, which is I found the idea of archetypes very, very strong, and that opens all kinds of possibilities. But then every time that I tried to see the archetypes in real life, and also how other people were applying it, it always felt like it was missing the mark a little bit. It always felt like there was too much context to be that simple, to be that like that directly applicable. Not always the case. Obviously, there were periods both in my life and also when other people were describing their experiences in their life where I saw it fitting quite well. But that's kind of like what I started to feel like, maybe this wasn't the best approach. But the way that I do see kind of the connection between my mother and also these experiences in general, first of all, well, I would say there is a connection, but I don't think necessarily overlaps with kind of like the framework of Jung that you were trying to impose. But also, maybe I'm wrong, so feel free to correct me. But the way that I see psychedelics is mostly that number one, that there's always a loosening of consciousness beyond what you're traditionally comfortable with, basically. Like it gets you outside of your own self, both phenomenologically, existentially, neurologically, basically everything you can think of. That alone is very valuable. And second, it also allows you a more symbolic way of thinking. And because of those two, the way that I like to think about it is that they allow you to see how reality is in a more accurate manner, because reality is symbolic, whether you like it or not. And also because you are the person that most restricts your ability to see reality correctly, because we're very stupid and we all have all kinds of biases, and we're very ingrained in our thought patterns. And so that's why I found psychedelics so useful. Now, how I see the loss of my mother, well, that can go in a lot of different directions. Very complicated thing to ask, but at least one way that I phrase it in the book, because I dedicate a whole chapter to the loss of my mother. How I see it impacting my life the most is that it's simply death has a way of imposing a reevaluation of what is real. And to me, that this was massively influential in my life. Every time that I was trying to figure out what's real or not, kind of in a Cartesian doubt type sense, if you follow that train of thought, there's no stopping point. Basically, you do have to go all the way down, as Descartes did. But then climbing yourself from there, it's very difficult. And the way he did it is not very fruitful. Not many people buy it. But you do have to. But if you accept that you can't go all the way there because you can't climb back out, that means that you have to stop somewhere. And like how exactly you know where to stand on what's real. And to me, one of the best answers that I found in my life is that you have to have an act of faith of what's real. You have to declare it, but then your declaration has to be coherent across your life, and it has to be sturdy enough to withhold everything that life throws at you. And one of the ways that I've found that is by making love the most real, because that is something that, at least once you grow up a little bit, maybe like someone that's a teenager, maybe they don't get this, but as you get older, you do realize that that's what matters the most in life. And kind of like what's the most important and what's the most real, they're not exactly the same thing, but they have a very, very tight affinity. And it's very complicated to untangle this philosophically. But it's true, nevertheless. So that's kind of like how I see the loss of my mother, which is like and to me this reflects my whole Christian experience as well, of how I see Christianity, which is like Christianity gets a lot of hate, and I understand why, given the culture we live in, for the role of guilt, which is negative. But there's also a healthy guilt in Christianity, which is unavoidable, which is like everything that you know you could have done and you didn't. And the thing about death is that makes that phenomena super salient to you, and in a way that you know that you can't possibly make up for it. It's like, my mother is gone. I could have been a better son. I could have been a million other things. There's a lot of things that were left unsaid, and I can't fix it. And I could have loved better. And so that guilt is a lot of what I got out of the passing of my mother. And I think that's quite healthy. Maybe not healthy in like a modern, superficial psychological sense, but healthy in the sense of the deepest possible level of my soul. And that's what matters. And so now, to tie this all back together, the reason why I kind of still made some connection between the two is because, to me, those are both looking deeper into reality. I'm looking deeper into reality when I take psychedelics, obviously not in a naive realism sense, but kind of in a proper, nuanced hermeneutic way through psychedelics. But then also with my mother, it's kind of like this shock of death, and also the loss of something that you can't reverse, that just makes you admit what actually matters.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm somewhat sorry that I sprung the question on you as well, because, I recognize sometimes these things are naturally big questions. But I appreciate you answering so thoughtfully. And I think it's certainly a good stance to take. And many of my experiences as well were I was confronted with, I guess, a mixture of death and love in many different ways at different levels of experience. And in the reflection afterwards, yeah, and I think that's good words, a good stance to take when it comes to, yeah, going out into the world. Okay, so let's get into the fact that we may be living in the age of spiritual blindness. So I'm going to go through some of the stuff and we'll try and unpack these trying times that some people say we might be living in. So you said, this is a quote, you said, our conception of dystopia is misplaced, projected onto a cinematic future of flying cars and sentient robots. This convenient fantasy prevents us from recognizing the dehumanized society we actually inhabit, one where values fade into nothingness, leaving only production and utility. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, and funny enough, kind of like that line of thinking is exactly what I mentioned previously when I mentioned kind of my LSD experience of kind of like this realization of the essence of technology. That's literally kind of what I wrote back then, which now I'm kind of rephrasing on another work. Um, but yeah, so basically, I think the problem is that people always view the very concept of dystopia has some technological thing in the future. And to some degree, this actually occurs before the concept of dystopia. It has to do with the very aspect of technological progress itself. It always feels like it's something in the future because what you grew up with, or at least what you have been accustomed, even if you didn't grow up with it initially, it always normalizes. Like we just get used to things, right? But things get progressed really quickly. Like my father always, jokes around, and he tells me this over and over again, which can get a bit annoying, but it's so true. It's like on his day, the fact that like we can have like a communication like this on a cell phone, like to him was absolutely wild. Like it was the peak of science fiction. Like that was utterly unthinkable by several orders of magnitude. But now, he just calls me on his phone, and here we are, right? And so it never feels like we actually arrive at this like hyper technology. And the reason you don't is because you're already there, and we've been there for quite a long time. But we just don't notice it, and it just keeps progressing. Now, obviously, just the fact that you have technological progress doesn't mean that it's a dystopia per se. That's kind of like a separate argument, I suppose, or a separate perspective. But it is the case because um, a lot of how our kind of technology has progressed and the role that it has played in society has shifted, has induced a shift of a particular way of thinking, which I like to call technological thinking. Um, and as I and the best way to think about it, really, like even though there's a lot of ways to impact this, is the notion of value itself, of meaning itself, becomes ever increasingly unintelligible. And this is not always obvious because not it's not like everyone or the culture at large necessarily admits it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Like it just depends. It's very context dependent. But at least implicit in its metaphysic, we can say, it just doesn't have space for what value is. It doesn't have space for what meaning is. And that's quite problematic because that's what human beings are. Human beings are a creature of meaning and value, like quite literally to the very bottom of it. And so that's what, in large part, creates this dystopia that we live in, but that we can never realize, or at least most people never realize. They just get ingrained this worldview that the world is just made out of things. It's made out of objects. Human beings are just some random evolutionary product. And what I mean, this is quite tricky to explain, because there's a lot of aspects of my thinking that I think are very easily misunderstood. So, for example, when I say like a random byproduct of evolution, it's not like I'm arguing for, like, I don't know, some god's uh, God pulling the strings of evolution, in the sense that it has purpose, a divine purpose, but more in the sense that uh, that we're viewing reality has random causality that we can't escape from, and that we can't possibly get any meaning out of it, which is more or less kind of the modern worldview. Um, so yeah, from that thought alone of like the technological dystopia, if you think hard enough, I think you can probably, like, just naturally on yourself. I think if you think it through, you can probably unpack a lot of my work just from that. So I could explain a lot further, but that's probably a good place to stop.
Okay, yeah, and we'll go through more of it. I want to just cycle back to your dad's sort of wise insights about the kind of creeping nature, and you mentioned in the work this idea of, where is it from? Is it Jared Diamond, the sort of creeping normality? How these
Yeah.
things do slowly kind of happen, and we don't realize it's happening because it's small incremental changes, right? Often, see here. So small incremental steps, each individual step seems harmless or too minor to object to, but together they lead to a major shift that would have been rejected if proposed all at once. And it feels as if, and I don't know if this is partly to do with how kind of technological advancement is at least seemingly exponential, right? And I think the data supports that we're seeing that more and more. That the kind of creep is shortening, it seems, between the kind of the bigger, broader effects. Um, yeah, but I think that's an interesting thing to reflect on, because we do take these things for granted. I think about, I existed in a time just before the internet, and then I remember getting dial up, and I remember having to sit and wait for for the internet to connect, and wait 20 minutes for a page to load, and someone couldn't be using the house phone. For anyone under, I don't know, 25 listening, that was a mobile phone, but it was in your house and connected to a landline. I joke, obviously, but yeah, all these things creep up on us, don't they? And it's hard to notice in the moment. Yeah, okay. So I just want to have a look here, right? This idea, you talk about how these systems, and I guess this happens on many different levels, how these systems become kind of so large so that they go beyond the dictates of like any one individual, and they kind of become a thing in themselves. An impersonal system that unfolds according to its own logic, producing consequences that are human driven in origin, yet for which no single human can be held accountable. Where do you see this happening the most in society?
This happens in tons of places, and probably the easiest way to grasp it, I think, is actually one of the oldest forms, which is the economy. Like, no one controls the economy, like, as a whole. Like, obviously, there's some shenanigans going on, a lot of politics and corruption and whatnot. So obviously, these people have influence, but like the phenomenon as a whole is quite unpredictable, and even them are at its mercy, and like no one can truly control it. So that's the easiest way to think about it. It's just that systems get very, very large, and then they're sustained by their own logic that no one can predict, no one can understand fully. Obviously, we can understand some economic principles and whatnot, So that's the easiest place to understand it. But I think the strongest example of it is AI, actually. And this is very seen clearly in kind of like the game theory behind how AI is developing. Like, it's very clear to most people that understand the field even reasonably well, that pushing full force with AI is a bad idea for like a million different reasons. But we're doing it anyway. And the reason we're doing it anyway, and we're going to continue to do it anyway, and no one can stop it, is precisely because it's a system of its own. And this doesn't necessarily have to be conceptualized in like some either in some supernatural way that it's just like, I don't know, some magical thing going on. Like, you don't have to think it that way. And it also, you don't have to think it as if it's like some I don't know, some kind of conspiracy or something. It can be understood in very straightforward terms, which is like there's just, as systems grow, it has some incentives in place to keep it growing in a particular direction. So, for example, one of the things that is largely influencing kind of this AI growth is that if anyone pulls it off, and no one knows if anyone is going to do it, and if they're going to do it, no one knows if it's going to be in the next 2 years or if it's going to be in the next 500. But whoever does it, and whoever does it first, it's going to make a lot of money. They might become the richest person, that ever existed by a very large margin. And so
just
there's a
to
lot
clarify, sorry to interrupt. Just to clarify, when you say whoever does it, just define it. What is the kind of where is everyone trying to head with it?
Yeah, so I mean it in just the most basic sense possible of like it has in the phenomena that most people consider, general intelligence, right?
Okay.
AGI. So that's how I mean it. But yeah, and so if you consider it in those terms, like that alone is a pretty clear cut example. So like it's not a good idea. No one reasonable wants it. Certainly the majority doesn't want it. But it's going to keep going anyway. And the kind of these kind of like politics and economics drivers are one of the largest driving forces of these kind of mechanisms in society. But there's others as well. They might just be a little bit more subtle and not as straightforward.
Yeah, and I've been reflecting a little bit on these kind of absolute power structures recently. Specifically, I won't sort of go into the depths of it, but comparing Jung's analysis of the Job story in the Bible with the internet, and how the internet in itself and what we see as kind of like internet culture, and that whole process, that interaction that we all have when we go on the internet, is, at least the way I see it, one of those kind of power structures that has its own kind of power as a result of, beyond any one individual, right? What is happening in those places. And at least the conclusion I came to, very basically speaking, much like the story, Jung's analysis of the story of Job with Yahweh being this kind of unreflective power, ultimate power, was it perhaps it falls to the individual then to kind of incarnate the internet, so to speak, and choose how we use it. Very, very basically speaking. So that's given us a sort of a lay of these power structures and these systems. With the internet in mind, you talk kind of about, I guess, various aspects of technology, but this seems true of the internet specifically, and I guess for a lot of people, this bit would be how they would probably encounter this the most, perhaps, is through the internet, which is how, in some sense, existence requires friction, and the internet in its omnipotence kind of allows us to have things at the press of a button, allows us to get things instantly, Amazon, delivery, whatever it is. And that experience, because we can cater it so much to ourselves, we lose a lot of that friction and it becomes kind of hollow. Is that a fair assessment of the internet in that sense? And what am I missing to that idea of the frictionless world of technology?
No, I think that's a very fair assessment, and I do use kind of that framework throughout my work. I do think that's exactly right. The only thing is that I think sometimes this can be slightly um, misframed, or at least not framed in the best way possible, which is it's not necessarily that just because something is easy that it doesn't have that it becomes fake in some degree, but nevertheless there is a deep association, and there's many aspects that apply to the internet, but I think the best place to understand it first is social media, where it's kind of like the very aspect that it's a medium that becomes um like so fast, like that basically introduces all kinds of distortions for the people that are using it. And then on top of that, there's this sense that you calibrate your expectations based on what your average experience is. And a lot of boomers like to, kind of like talk crap about these young people. They don't know what is it like to work hard, blah blah blah. But like, there's kind of a true sense of that when applied to modernity, based on precisely kind of the speed and easiness of doing things. Um, and social media, I think, is a pretty good example, because it's, as the name implies, it's very related to our sociality, and I think that's very important. So I think that's especially easy for that to go corrupt in some way. But one example that I came across very recently that I thought was quite interesting and made me think quite a lot about this notion of friction is that, given that you're probably very similar in age with me, kind of given your description of your experience of the early internet. And so if that's the case, and if you're the kind of person to kind of fidget with the internet and with kind of like early technology and computers and whatnot, you might remember that a lot of the experience um, include a lot of troubleshooting. Like things just stopped working, and then you had to figure it out. And it wasn't easy to figure it out. It's not like there was a billion YouTube videos about every conceivable problem. It might even be before YouTube, might even be before search engines were any good. Like before, it was pretty crap. But people still troubleshooted a lot because they had no other choice, and that's not common now. And it's actually, it might surprise you that it's not, because to some degree, at least for people like us, it almost feels like a basic aspect of just like normal experience of interacting with something. But not so much. Like some people nowadays, just like they just give up, they just buy something else, they don't need to, basically. Uh, and that actually, obviously, that doesn't just apply to, I don't know, some pirated software that you just, downloaded from some shady website. Like, obviously, that has implications for other things. And so you don't experience that friction. And then you also don't know how to deal when that friction inevitably arises in other forms. And I get that this might sound, I don't know, a little bit too pessimistic, a little bit too, I don't know, some old people just complaining about modern times or something. And there's some validity to that, but it's not just that. I think there's definitely a real effect that comes from this nature of being completely frictionless that comes with technology and modern internet. And I do think that is quite problematic, I think.
Yeah, that's an aspect of creeping normality that I haven't even considered, but you're totally right. I think about the amount of times that, yeah, something would either go wrong, or I think about it a lot. What comes to my memories is like trying to install games, I'd get like a game or something, some PC game, and then it just wouldn't run, and then it'd be a case of hunting through forums and going on like a proper quest, like a mythological digital quest to find the solution to the problem. And yeah, it's I've never thought about that and the impact that have, but it does present a degree of problem solving. You get to sharpen those problem solving skills, right? And yeah, you're right. There is everything on the internet now. I've got a friend at work who has managed to decorate his entire house and do every single amount of possible bit of work you could imagine that normally you'd have to, maybe get a tradesperson in or whatever else. And he's done it all off the back of YouTube videos. And that's obviously, I guess, a positive aspect of the internet. But yeah, having that friction in the kind of older versions of this stuff, yeah, did give you, did at least, at the very least, if you were going to get absorbed into, 4 hours of MSN Messenger or Habbo Hotel, you might have to solve a couple of side quests along the way to do it, right? Which is, yeah, again, something that I've completely forgotten about. Yeah, okay. And where else was I going to go with that? So you mentioned the distortions, and you use the analogy of the mirror, right? You say the advent of the silvered glass mirror in the 16th century changed the world radically. The mirror enabled self-knowledge and self-obsession. It promised to show us as we are, but instead made us newly aware of how we appear to others, inaugurating a split in consciousness, the self as subject and the self as object of scrutiny. And you talk about the digital age employing mirrors in 3 key ways. Can you explain those 3 key ways for us?
Oof, I couldn't recall from the top of my head. But
So
if you want,
I've got them here. If it helps, you can go into the ones that you feel comfortable going into. So historical mirrors that inaugurated modern self-consciousness, funhouse mirrors that distort social reality, and compulsive mirrors that trap us in self-monitoring loops.
yeah. So obviously, so first of all, like the actual notion of the mirror, like historically, as you mentioned first, I think is quite interesting, which is like you kind of take it as a given that mirrors just exist, and that you have this sense that you always know what you look like, and that's not actually. It's actually crazy to me when I was writing, because like, it made me think so much about how much of my human experience, of like primal human experience, is actually mediated by the current technological, period that I live in. And mirrors are such a good example of that. But most people didn't look at themselves like, several times a day. And it might not even be intentional, even if you're someone that, is not overly obsessive about their appearance, but like you still see it as you're, I don't know, walking across the street and you look at the store or something, and you see your reflection. But you do see it, and that affects how you think about yourself, how you present. Like it does make you self-conscious, exactly as you described. Um, and that is super problematic, especially because most people don't realize it. Because again, it just feels like the baseline. It just feels like that's what normal human experience is like, but it's not. And obviously, the mirror is just one example, but this affects many areas of life. And one of the things that I think is the most problematic is when it comes to kind of the analogy of the mirror as it pertains to the internet experience. And funny enough, this is also related to the kind of this notion of friction that we were talking about earlier, and especially as related to social media as well, which I kind of alluded to, and I actually wanted to get into this direction, but I wasn't sure if it was a good idea, so kind of deviated a little bit. But one of the problems that I think is most problematic with social media is the notion of being governed by these algorithms, especially algorithms that have no transparency. And again, it's related to this notion of friction, because the algorithm is always removing friction toward a certain goal. That alone is already pretty dubious, but then on top of it, the goal is pretty crap, which is like extort you for as much money as humanly possible. And so it's always caving, these paths, so that you have the experience as curated as humanly possible. And a lot of the times is the way that you can do that is precisely by being a mirror of yourself, by reflecting what you want to see. And again, connecting it back, for example, to the topic of that we started the conversation, relationship to psychedelics. For example, when I was discussing the relationship, kind of an analogy towards how I experienced the loss of my mother, as looking deeper into reality. Why do I look deeper into reality with psychedelics? Because it gets outside myself, right? That's like that's the exact opposite of what I just said about social media, right? So it's like the reality is always outside, and it's always what you have to fight against. But social media and internet in general is to a large degree precisely the opposite. And so a lot of the condition of modernity is precisely that you're trapped in this house of mirrors that is incredibly hard to escape from and to even realize that you're there. And I think it's particularly worrying because you can never even truly understand the extent of it. Like sometimes you have little glimpses of that, of like, you sometimes feel like, oh, actually my model of reality was completely skewed and it just like adjusted a little bit because I had this flash of insight. But it's actually quite crazy when that happens because you didn't know that before. So like, how do you know how screwed up your perception of the world is now? So it's like you're always in this vulnerable, position that you never quite sure where you stand. And that's if you have awareness, because if you don't, it's even worse. You just take it as it is. So yeah, I think the mirror is the perfect analogy for this condition of modernity for the human being, precisely because of all these reasons.
Yeah, the idea of it made me think as well, and I never thought of it in the same way that you said, that you take the idea of these things being a given again, and then you think, well, there would have been that time where, maybe you could look in a clear bit of water, but again, not with the clarity, with the kind of the clearness that you would get from a mirror. Yeah, and that distortion, the other thing I like, the way the internet, the way that distortion, the way I guess things are fed to us, there was this idea of these domains become performance driven that you talk about, and really highlighted to me, I think you used the example of how communal singing to this kind of like performative singing, perhaps, say on social media, we all see someone doing a cover and then you might share it. And I went over to my brother's, and my brother happens to love karaoke to the point where he will have that in a room in his house and he may just sing in there on his own. And when I was around there the other day, my brother, my father, my sister, we sang a couple of songs together, kind of at each other. And there was this, it really made me think of that communal aspect. And there was a different sensation that arises in that moment of connection, of relation, of, yeah, that in the communal aspect of singing. I am not much of a singer. I'm certainly not very, don't have a great ability for it, and don't overly enjoy singing sort of performatively, but there is something in the sharing of that with my siblings and my father that had a kind of, dare I say it, almost sacred sort of element to it. And again, it's something, a lot of this seems to be stuff that does just creep in and you don't notice. And when I was reading your work, that's why I liked it so much, is there's all these little light bulb moments where I'm thinking, yeah, like that's not as much of a thing anymore. Can you talk more on this idea of how maybe culture has shifted more from the kind of being experience to is it the Eric Fromm being and having kind of
Yeah,
modes?
exactly.
Yeah, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so basically the framework is that there's two levels of experience. So there's the having modes where you're worried about acquiring things, any kind of acquire. Like in the reason why this is so hard to grasp, I think, for some people is that they truly don't understand how this type of thinking can apply to many aspects of their life, even when it looks like they're the opposite. So, for example, a relationship might sound very healthy, but like you can even have a relationship but being framed in your mind as this kind of like having mode of like I need to have this relationship for X Y reason. And so it's always this notion of consumption to some degree. That's the best way to think about it. And also very related to the consumption is that it's always purpose driven. It's kind of like it's this thing where it always has a. It's also very connected to, again, technological thinking in general, because this type of interaction with the world, if you think about it, because it's utility driven, it's also a kind of manipulation to some degree. It's kind of like the way that I'm engaging with reality is always because I want to get something out of it. But the being mode isn't about acquiring things. It's about authenticity. It's about like living fully in the presence and without like letting yourself go towards external things. And these notions of external things and of being pulled is very connected to this notion of authenticity, precisely because and the best way to understand this, even though a lot of people might be antagonistic to it, is precisely how Christianity frames it, which is like the human being suffers from passions, which is kind of like very similar to the Buddhist notion of kind of attachments, and that's kind of like always making you lose yourself by always trying to get something else, and that get something else is always driven by something that is enticing that in you, like from the outside. And that's also why there's always this tradition of kind of like of being some kind of agency behind kind of like the human condition of you being a victim to these drives. It's precisely because it's kind of like it feels like this outside force that kind of infiltrates your mind and then kind of makes you act towards a certain purpose that is not in your best interest. And so yeah, I think that type of framework of the being and the having mode is very fruitful, and I think it maps into the technological thinking and its opposite, which in my work I try to frame that as the sacred. I think that maps very well, and I think it might be helpful for people to get into the right mindset.
Yeah, and maybe we can segue into that a little bit now. But what was coming to my mind there is going back to the idea of these kind of power structures that form beyond the control of any one person, and the kind of pull of whatever it is in the external world to kind of tempt your passions. It's this whole idea of like limbic capitalism. The very structure of the internet now is built maybe isn't even the right word, has sort of been constructed, has formed without any one person sort of making that decision to get your attention. The thumbnails, everything. It's to draw you in, to compel you to get up, to pick up your phone, to look at your phone, and then when you are looking at your phone, to stay where you are or to be pulled into another realm of distraction. And the realms of distraction are vast and many, and it is not easy. I am someone who likes to think I rattle on about how we live in an age of disenchantment, how we need to rediscover the symbolic and the sacred on this show and in my life. I am always looking at my phone, and it pains me. I wish I could say that it wasn't the case, but it is. It's more of a, I think of it as a literal compulsion. It's that kind of pulling it out of the pocket. It doesn't feel like addiction per se. It does feel like compulsion. Okay, so
But just to chime in a little bit, like that kind of experience is exactly also what made me really write more about technology, because I suffer from exactly the same thing. And at least to me, like that's such an uncomfortable feeling, because it truly feels like you're losing agency, and it's also like, and again, coming back to the creeping normality, like it would be, I could not believe you if you went back in time and told my younger self, pre-cell phones, that the average human being would spend like, I don't know, 4 hours on their phone or something. Like it's even an hour, if you think about it, like that's kind of pretty crazy. And like almost no one just spends an hour. Like whoever does that, it's almost a saint in today's culture, right? So it's just crazy. And that was a lot of my motivation to also try to well, number one, kind of articulate my thoughts better, but also let other people know like this is messed up, and you need to think more deeply about it. And something that I also think kind of funny is that to some degree, the technological technologization of society makes it harder to uh, grasp certain things, and there's kind of like the loss of meaning, the loss of values, etc. That we talked about. But also to some degree, because it gets so extreme, it also makes certain things a lot easier to spot. So, for example, all these notions of like forces that have agency, that is way easier to conceptualize now than it was for my grandfather by several orders of magnitude. And again, this notion of addiction, of compulsion, like again, like this is way easier now. And in my mind, like that makes your job and your life at least way easier insofar as you can understand the typical religious frame of mind. Like that's a benefit to some degree, even though it's so messed up. And so you can understand these notions of distributed cognition, of power relations, of kind of these attachments that you can kind of form to outside things. These things are way more obvious now than they were. At least if you kind of like shift your perspective just slightly, which is precisely why I'm trying to drive more awareness.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I was reflecting on that recently and questioning whether there maybe is or there will be a kind of an antiadromia of how we engage with the world because of that, right? The way I specifically noticed was did this video on like the slop archetype is what I called it. This idea of, since AI has been putting out the video content, it's a very specific kind of content, and I think it almost feels like a parody of the stuff we've been seeing because it's so amplified. You know, the kind of content, the kind of Mr. Beastified, the kind of limbic capitalism content is there to draw you in. The AI stuff, in its however it's manifested because of the technology, the limitations of the technology, whatever goes into that, we've come up with these terms now, the younger generation, I guess, of slop, for that content, the idea of brain rot. And it made me think that, is that emerging in the culture, causing people to go, hang on a minute, what am I doing? Because it does creep in when all of a sudden you're watching the novelty of maybe watching, I don't know, the YouTube cat videos in the beginning and then developing into kind of other more carefully constructed content. That is a slow creep where you can kind of become engaged with it and not notice it happening. But then when the content becomes more and more absurd, to, again, not by any specific person, but because of in two ways, the power structure of limbic capitalism and the internet as a whole, and the power structure of AI developing, produces this content that is just so like against it breaks through. I sort of framed it as like a trickster, in that it has the ability to captivate you into a trance and to lure you in and ultimately destroy you. But it also has the ability to, in an indirect way, wake you up to something that you're maybe not aware of. And by showing you so much slop to the point where you kind of, the veil becomes pierced and you notice you're watching dogs with water spraying out of their mouth to old people stood in their house, those AI videos that seem to be everywhere, you go, what is this rubbish? And then it forces you to reflect and to see what actually matters to you. Does that kind of resonate? Do you think that could happen in the culture, that there could be this pendulum swing back to the sacred, to even not as far as the sacred, but maybe just to a sense of non whatever we've got on the internet, for lack of a better word.
No, I completely agree, and I do think that's the case. Like I kind of hold two incoherent views at the same time. Like to some degree, I am quite pessimistic about kind of the advancement of the technological age, because there is this sense where technological thinking just compounds on itself, where it's kind of like the more it grows, the more it becomes this totalizing worldview that can't really make sense of anything that goes outside of it, and then it just gets narrower and narrower over time, and it's very hard to escape from it. And so, on that sense, when I think about it like that, I'm like, this is hopeless, basically. Like we're all screwed. Like there's no going back to some degree. But in some other ways, I suppose this maybe changes a little bit depending on my mood or kind of the context of the starting point of my thinking, the examples maybe that I'm working through in my mind. But there's also another sense, which is there is hope. And the reason why there is hope is because despite this totalizing, narrowing dynamic of technological thinking, no matter what you do, it's still antithetical to the human experience. Like that's not what the human being is. And the reason why this gap is meaningful is precisely because it always creates this opportunity of you realizing it's like, oh crap, this doesn't make any sense, or like this is completely absurd, which is precisely the experience that you were describing, right? And so, and I wrote about this, I think, even in my first book, in the Search of the Infinite, which is like the more you're pushed to the edge, the more you can kind of like see it that something is wrong, because and it's just kind of like embedded, because that's not the type of creature that you are. And so that always, I suppose, leaves some, last threads of hope. But again, there's also the opposite argument, and I really struggle to kind of like see how those fit together. Like who, I don't know which one will win. Sometimes it's a bit hard to tell, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I'm all for holding the tension of opposites and acknowledging the both and of it, and that can, the likelihood, if those two realities were to sort of manifest, and it's likely going to be some people will go one way, other people will go another way. I think, to kind of tie in with the psychedelic experience, I think it was Terence McKenna who said the weirder things get in kind of culture and reality, politics, culture, everything, that's kind of a good sign. It shows that we're getting to this point of like something breaking through that maybe we need to be looking at. And I certainly can't help but feel in the last 10 years that things are getting weirder. But again, I wonder how much of my kind of biases am I carrying into that? Were they thinking that 4 days after the invention of the mirror? Were they saying, this is getting too weird now, I don't I don't like this, I want to go back to looking in the muddy stream, I don't like seeing this. But yeah, I don't know, but let's hope. Let's take the message of hope there. Okay, so let's touch just a little bit more on AI, because obviously that is kind of the hot topic. We've sort of touched on it a bit there with the videos. I like that you refer to them as engines of bullshit. I think that is that is a nice way to frame it. If you're taking the kind of critical stance, I think it's good. It's got a punch. Why are they engines of bullshit? Give me the main concerns on their kind of what they do. We've talked a little bit about where the kind of conversation around them and the technology around them, but as they are now, what they do, what's the problem there, do you think?
Right. So when I use the term bullshit, I use it in like a SME technical term that was coined by the philosopher Frankfurt. And the way that he he kind of makes this conceptual distinction is that if someone is lying to you, they care about the truth, but they're just concealing the truth for their own agenda. But if someone is bullshitting you, it's not like they're concealing the truth. They just don't care about the truth. Like, it's just completely irrelevant, right? And so this makes this very funny and but still useful kind of description. It's a very nice book, actually. I think that's like a lot of times people think philosophy is just like these grand abstractions that are super hard to understand. And I think this is a wonderful book sometimes to like get a little intro to philosophy as well, because like it's very short. It has like 50 pages maybe. It has no jargon. It's just like kind of untangling all these distinctions that I just told you about, but in a more sophisticated way. Super enjoyable to read. But anyway, this is quite fitting for AI precisely because AI doesn't care about the truth, and it doesn't care because it cannot care, like literally the most technical sense that you can think of. And so it's just spewing bullshit because all that it's making is statistical inferences. Now it's not like meaningless statistical inferences, because the statistical inferences are constructed about like real epistemic relationships that are embedded in our language, because our language is meaningful, right? Like my sentences have a certain structure, they have a certain logic to it, and therefore if you do enough statistics on it, although it requires a lot of computing power, you can untangle that, and so you can at least make this kind of like basic inference about the likelihoods of something that makes coherent sense within the context that it was spoken. And that's why LLMs work so well in this like basic conversational sense. However, they still don't understand anything at all. And so like the example that I gave on the book, maybe you didn't come across with it yet. I think it's a bit maybe later on. I don't know how good of an example it is. maybe you can tell me. But to me, it made quite an intuitive sense to kind of to make people understand kind of like some of the dynamics of LLMs. It's kind of like, imagine that you have a child that is quite young, and then you ask it a complicated question like, I don't know, why is carbon important to life, for example? Now, the child has no idea what that question even means. Like, he doesn't have any possible intellectual power to even consider answering that question. However, imagine that it has a very, very large library that has all kind of like the relationships of language that have ever been uttered across mankind. And so if that's the case, she can know based on just pure statistics that when someone says something about life, that this is associated with a bunch of other concepts, like, for example, biology, right? And so in the same way that you can do that for a high level, let's say life to biology, you can kind of go deeper and deeper and deeper into this, right? So, for example, eventually she might reach a biology textbook, and eventually she might reach some chapter on carbon, and and so on and so forth. And then if she does that, if she had enough statistical relationships, eventually she might be able to reach the paragraph that explains why carbon is important for life, and she can spell it out, and it's correct, but she still has no idea whatsoever what she just said. And so that's how LLMs work, essentially. They're very, very sophisticated machines, and they work really well for a lot of purposes, but they still fundamentally don't understand anything. And that's also why they're bullshitters. Like, the two things go hand in hand together.
So would that be, if I'm not mistaken, the reason that Google AI, when asked if it was okay to eat rocks, said it was okay to have one rock a day, because it found it in a Reddit forum that was like some joke thread, but it was obviously, I guess, in that large library of stuff, there's not much literature on eating rocks because it's not literature worthy. However, the one piece of literature there was a post on a Reddit forum that the AI, in searching its library, found and then gave the answer to. That's kind of what's going on there, right?
Yeah, it's very similar to that, although it's a bit context dependent. And I think a lot of these memes are a lot of the times those kinds of examples are from much older models. And so, for example, I'm pretty sure I remember seeing that.
This was a while back.
When Google was Bard, it wasn't even Gemini yet. And so those types of questions, you generally don't get like that kind of like stupidity with kind of modern heavy LLMs. But yeah, the kind of the underlying thought is correct, which is because they're just statistical relationships without understanding, especially when the question gets a bit weird or kind of like it's a very unusual context or it's a bit tricky, then yeah, sometimes you just spew something that completely makes no sense whatsoever.
Okay. So in this, we've kind of laid part of the landscape out, and I encourage everyone to go on your website and check out the text themselves, because as I said to you before we recorded, not only is it incredibly informative and interesting, you have a brilliant way of writing, and it's a pleasure to read. So I'll put the links down in the the show description and things like that. But given that that's some of the landscape of where we're at with technology and the world, what, I don't want to say advice necessarily, because I know not everyone wants to give advice, but in terms of re-engaging with the sacred in this landscape, how do you see a good way to maybe start doing that, ways to start doing that?
I would say the first step and the most important step is always to realize that something is wrong. To like realize that this is not what society is meant to be. This is not healthy culture, and it's inherent pathologically. It's inherently pathological to the human condition in a very, very deep way. So that is the most important, first of all, because if you're still trapped in the house of mirrors, then nothing's going to get done. And also, one of the reasons why this is so important is because I don't think that the sacred is intelligible until you get out of kind of like a typical, completely secular, completely materialistic worldview. And I've noticed this with a lot of people that I speak with. A lot of the times I'm trying to nudge them a little bit towards understanding, what the sacred might be. And it's very hard because they don't have the conceptual grammar to make sense of it. And they don't because their mind's completely messed up about what a real thing is. It's a very kind of naive ontology that anything that doesn't conform to it, so it either sounds silly, but most of the time, which I think is especially concerning, is that not only is it silly, it's just like I literally cannot understand what the hell you're saying. Like it makes no sense to me. And so that is the most important. Now, how to get out of that, I think to some degree requires some intellectual work of actually understanding, like, for example, some of the mechanisms that I was just trying to describe about LLMs, for example, why LLMs don't understand. Like, I think that's important to understand, to kind of like break the spell that these things aren't human, and that what the human being is very different than a machine. And LLMs are just one example, but there's a lot of other concepts as well. I think it's also important to understand the whole philosophical context that led to modernity and so on and so forth. And this is typically advice that I hate to give because it feels very elitist to some degree, which I try as much as I can to not be, because to some degree it's kind of my realm. It's kind of like I'm the philosophy guy, and I'm telling other people, yeah, you should study philosophy, and people, yeah, no shit. Like, but it's like, but I think it's true. I think it's just kind of unavoidable. I wish it wasn't the case. I wish I wasn't in this position, but I think it's still kind of the best way to approach it to some degree. However, that aside, I think one of the most important things is to at least not fall prey to things that you can recognize that are inherently about money. Like, that is the lowest hanging fruit you can possibly have. If you don't know anything, if you have no idea where to go or what to do, if you're following certain systems and certain paths and certain patterns that are within a system that its sole purpose is to make money, you can be 99% sure that's not a good idea and that's messing you up in some degree. And also, if you're trying to embody some kind of recovery, that's also a hint of what the solution is, which is its opposite, which is like things that are that don't have money as a goal. A lot of the times, those kind of practices can help you understand exactly, what presence is, like what the being mode actually is. And that's also why ritual is so important in kind of religious traditions. Like, what exactly are you doing when you're following some religious ritual? Like, you're not trying to, certainly not trying to make money. You're certainly not trying to gain power. A lot of these rituals are, to some degree, they're kind of like utility free, and to some degree they are the case because that is the point. The point is to not have a point, because you're kind of like entering this mode of reflexivity, and it's also kind of this element where you need to force yourself on what is important. Like, it creates this gap that you're trying to analyze, like, what exactly am I doing and what am I doing it for? And so I think that's a pretty important part. But again, the problem with ritual, for example, is that we come back to the previous problem, which is like, in my opinion, in my experience, for example, one of the best ways that I found to let go of technological thinking, even though that I'm still prey to it, like everyone else, like I'm certainly not special, but I found meditation and prayer very helpful for me. But for someone that is kind of within the grasp of technological thinking and kind of the scientific mindset, like, meditation is intelligible to them. Well, prayer is most certainly completely unintelligible to them, number one. But even meditation is going to be a little bit unintelligible to them, because they're going to perceive meditation as another technological tool that, oh, I just need to kind of like, reduce stress so I can be a more productive worker, like the typical framing of Silicon Valley. Like, even that gets corrupted. So that's the whole problem, is that even these kind of like spiritual tools, even those kind of get exploited to kind of work for the system. So I know that this is not very a hopeful answer, but that's what I think.
And I think even the way you talk about the kind of ontology of our culture that is baked in almost. Even that, the kind of having mode falls into prayer, doesn't it? People asking God for wishes and for favors. That's something that I make sure that I really don't do in my life. You think about it with the kind of the spiritual person talking about manifesting. You may not call it God, you might call it the universe, but I'm gonna go out. I'm gonna put this out into the universe and manifest my dream job, manifest the perfect partner, manifest this. And Peter Kingsley has this line where he says, we need to basically start paying attention inwardly, because it's not that the gods aren't there effectively, it's that we're not listening, and we need to kind of reorientate ourselves as Western civilization to care for the gods if we are going to expect the gods to care for us. Now, he's talking, I guess, symbolically, perhaps archetypically, about the internal structures of our psyche. He's not making any metaphysical claim, but I think that is to even see that having mode trickle down into effectively modern prayer, right? I think it shows you just how much this stuff creeps in, just how it seeps into every aspect of what we do. But look, I'm hopeful, and I think you are too, right? I think love is the way. Orientate yourself around love. I think we can agree on that, and kind of be open-minded. And
the curious thing about love, though, like this is something that I'm still struggling a lot myself. This is actually a huge like chapter in my in my follow-up book to In Search of the Infinite, which follows the same format, but it's just whatever came afterwards. And this is something that I actually struggle a lot literally in my last experience, which was not that while ago. So, for example, when I talked about kind of like trying to say that philosophy is important, but then at the same time feeling bad about it because like it's not everyone's jams and people can have different interests, right? Now, one thing that you would see over and over again, especially towards the end of my book, In Search of the Infinite, is that I keep questioning the role of philosophy. It's like at some point I'm like, now I get it. Why do I need to keep searching for philosophy? Like, why can't I just get my shit together, focus on what's most important, stop reading all these dense books that are like super niche and that have this, sure, they have some truth and utility, but it's like this tiny glimpse that God knows how that's going to connect to my life, eventually. Like, why do all of that? Why, like, I have these flashes of insight of what actually matters, what I should care about, but then I don't do it. I still feel this drive towards philosophy, towards knowledge, and then what's all that stuff for? However, at the same time, I also think back about, okay, how did I get to that insight in the first place? Like, how did that get a clear mind of what to care about? Well, that was through philosophy. And so I do feel this reluctance of recommendation and not wanting to be elitist, but at the same time, I do think that there's a good point, which is, for example, when you say, focusing on love is, a very obvious starting place that we can all agree, and I do agree. But when I think back, for example, at the start of when I started to write the book, if he had told me that, I would have said, well, yes, of course. But the problem is, I didn't actually know what love was in the true deepest sense, which again, it comes back to what I was saying before, which is like when you're in the grasp of technological thinking, like it just wraps your mind. And so like things that fall outside of it become less intelligible. Now, it didn't become fully unintelligible. Like I did recognize that love is a thing and that you should pursue love, but it was a very shallow form of love. And that's the whole problem, right? So it's kind of like you want to give recommendations to people, but like by the very nature of the condition of the people receiving that advice, it's just not gonna end up, nailing as well. And so I'm very conflicted about this whole thing of that, like love and philosophy, and it's actually a huge problem for me right now.
Well, let's say hold this tension and balance. Anyone listening, if you want to try and step out, first you got to be aware. You got to be aware that you're looking at too much slop, and then we've got to start thinking. And maybe the way I always like to think about it, right, is even if you're reading all these different ideas, even if there's, you don't really want to learn what to think. You want to learn how to think, in my opinion, right? And reading all these different ideas, obviously you got to be wary of recency bias. You read the next book, you think, this is my philosophy now, I'll stick with this. But reading lots of ideas, it does train you on how to think, right? And much of these different insights you would have came to, it's because you read an awful lot of books. And then I guess, how you interpret different things presented to you, be it, you saying lead with love, every person's going to have their own perception of what love is, and also the ideas in themselves that's going to develop over time. That's kind of what happens in your memoir, right? The way things develop through the experiences over 7 years, was it 7 years?
Yep.
Yeah. All the more reason for people to read it as well. I don't know. It is a messy problem, isn't it? But I think we've got to do our best, And worst comes to worst, if the world does end up on fire, at least we'll have AI videos and VR. I don't know. I'm trying to find a positive spin, but I don't know. But what I would recommend is everyone read your work. I was going to get you to suggest some other books to read on here now, but I'm not going to do that because you do that on your own Instagram, right?
Yeah,
You
that's
had
true.
Go on.
Yeah, I have an Instagram page. It's at Tiago Books. And I do read a lot, and so a lot of times I share what I'm reading. I also share book recommendations in general, like sometimes even for beginners, people that are just trying to get into philosophy in general. I haven't done that as much because I've been so busy, and those require a bit more extra time to craft out. Um, but yeah, if you like books, if you like philosophy, if you like theology, religious studies, mythology, all this kind of things, cognitive science to some degree, haven't been posting as much, but yeah, if this conversation in general was enjoyable and you like to read, then yeah, I'll check it out.
And second point, where can people find the memoir and your other work as well?
Yeah, so that's at tiagovf.com. So Tiago is my first name, and then the other two are my initials for Vasconcelos and Faleiro. But in case that's hard to kind of understand or to type out, the easiest way is to just Tiago Books on Instagram, and then I have a link on bio, and then you can just follow it from there.
And you got the podcast as well?
Yeah, that's true. I also have my own podcast, just called Anagoge Podcast. Yeah, I talk with a lot of different people from all kinds of backgrounds, but especially lately, a bit more focused on philosophy. So if you're into that kind of jam, then definitely check it out. It is a bit more technical, I would say, but it also depends from conversation to conversation. But yeah, if philosophy is something you're interested in, then it might be worth checking out.
Awesome. Tiago, thank you so much for your time. Yeah, these ideas are fascinating, and you have a really fantastic ability to write about them and talk about them. And some of them, they're a bit heady. I'm a messy thinker, so it's nice to speak to someone like yourself that speaks with clarity and conciseness when it comes to ideas that can be a little bit tricky to get our heads around. I guess not only in the ideas themselves, but in, as we've discussed, the way our materialist ontologies are so baked in that it's hard to even conceptualize this stuff being a thing. With all of that considered, you do a fantastic job of talking about it. And also the amount that you read. When I saw that recent post you did that I think went sort of viral, the big stack of books you read in 2025, I generally, I stepped away from making content for a few days because it made me, you talk about these moments of realization, it made me realize that, I love to read, and a lot of what I do with this channel is dependent on reading, right? But it made me realize that in the process of making lots of content, kind of riding that wave, I hadn't read nearly as much. An embarrassing amount of reading had been done really for what I should be doing. And that in itself was the kind of, we talk about being pulled in by technology. That was me being pulled in by the kind of trying to ride the wave of the algorithm when things were going good, being pulled in when I was kind of in a flow of like putting the content together, making the content, when actually I could start to feel an inner friction where things weren't like feeling great. I was putting out videos that were doing reasonably well for the channel size, the channel small size, but things were feeling off. And then I saw your post and I kind of stepped back, and then I started reading your work. And I think that all culminated in this moment of, oh no, I'm putting out less. I'm putting out less stuff. I'm going to pick up new books. I'm not just going to make content on the ideas that I know and that I'm familiar with. I'm going to explore new ideas. And that in itself was a very expansive experience for me that's kind of set me up to tackle 2026 slightly differently than I think I might have. So I thank you for that deeply. Yeah, this has been awesome. So we know where everyone can find you. Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. But Tiago, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was super interesting. I'm glad that the post was inspirational for you. I think more reading is always a good thing. So yeah, thanks again.